Today's scripture text comes to us from John chapter 5, verses 6 through 13. And I invite you to follow along as I read. It says this: When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, though, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now, there were plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Today's sermon is on abundance. We're in the second sermon in a series on generosity, which is one of Liberty's core values. And today I want to do something very awkward, which is talk about money in church. That's not an easy thing, because I grew up as a young guy, as a pastor, and when I ever thought about money in church, guess what I thought of first? Jets. It was always about some shady pastor getting people for money online, flying off in a jet somewhere, people taking money. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yes. I'll show you my jet after the service if you want to see it. So I grew up where it was always awkward and you never wanted to talk about money. And one of the things that I've grown more comfortable with in time is realizing that Jesus talked about money a lot and that it's deeply connected to our faith. And if I'm a pastor and I want to help people know Jesus and I want to help people develop their faith, then we have to talk about abundance and money and those kinds of things. And so that's what we'll do a little bit today. Now, I studied a guy named Jonathan Edwards for many years of my life. I did a PhD on him. And so there were days that would go by where I would go to bed at night imagining that I had conversations with Jonathan Edwards. He was an 18th century Puritan pastor in New England. And one of the things that he's most famous for, of all things, is giving an awakening sermon. And so if you're an English lit major, you would have read it. Most high school seniors even have to read one of his sermons. It was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, but he would have to give this sermon once a year because that was his job as a pastor, which was to preach about how sinful people are and how much they need God's grace. It was kind of like a rite of passage for a pastor. And he was just so good at it, he became famous for it, right? Even though it wasn't really his heart or what he loved to do. That's what I feel like I'm doing right now. I have to preach about stewardship at a church, but if you're here for the first time, and I met someone here at 9 a.m., it was their first Sunday ever being here, and I was like, "Man, I'm so sorry you came on Stewardship Sunday." Like, bad timing, man. Well, just know that I hope this still hits, and the gospel is still preached, and I encourage you and invite you to be a part of what God's doing. So we're going to talk today a little bit about abundance through speaking about the Sermon on the Mount. And today I'm going to talk about 3 things. 1, how generosity is an invitation. Generosity is an invitation. 2, is that Jesus invites us to work with what we have. And 3, that we're called to be thankful. That's where we're going. That's the roadmap. So here we go. You might remember when we started reading how weird it starts. And it starts like this. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he turned to Philip and he asked this: "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" And then it says this, I love this. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. This is a super shady move of Jesus, right? Like, he didn't really ask because he wanted to know new information. He was asking, it says, to test Philip. And this is how it went down. Picture this. So Jesus is up. The Sea of Galilee's here. They're up on this massive hillside. I've actually been there. You can go to where this is. And you can picture, it says there were 5,000 men. That means there might have been 10,000 people, 20,000 people in total. We don't really know. In a very patriarchal culture, they only counted dudes. We would shift that today. Could you imagine if we only counted church attendance by men? Those would be diminished numbers. We inflate them here. I'm just teasing. All right, so Jesus is preaching to all these people. And they're up on this hillside. And, it wasn't like there was a Sheetz over on the corner where you could go and get food any time of the day. Instead, they were up on this hillside. There was no food anywhere around. And so he turns to Philip and he goes, "Hey, Philip, what are we going to do? I've been preaching so good for so long that we've stayed out here way too long. And now these people are going to get hungry. They might even faint on their way back home. What are we going to do to feed them?" How would you respond if Jesus asked you that question? Well, he responded by saying, Jesus, are you being real right now? It would take over a year's wages to pay for this thing. So in other words, this is what went down. Jesus asked Philip, how are we going to feed all these people? And Philip responds by saying, well, did you budget for this? Like, where's the budget? Like, I don't understand, Jesus. You're telling me you just thought of this right now? And then he would say, I didn't see this in the strategic plan. I didn't see any budget for this. Like I would never hire you, ironically, to do my wedding, Jesus, because you have no clue how to do event planning. Here we are with 20,000 people, and now we're going to try to feed them, and we don't have caterers set up. We don't have any planning in place. We don't have distribution lines. When we do communion here at Liberty, it's hard enough with 400 people to funnel people through, right? Here's Jesus trying to feed 5,000 people, and he's got no plan for how to do it. Think about that. And so Philip, he turns to him and he says, hey, Philip, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? And Philip's response is just like mine and yours, which is just to look at Jesus with incredulity at his ignorance and foolishness that Jesus would pretend like this could actually happen. Because he didn't plan, and he didn't know, and he didn't know how. If Jesus was asking you that day, and you were in that crowd, and you were standing next to him, and you see all these hungry people, and he turns to you and he says, hey, Roger, hey, Kelsey, hey, Thad, how are we going to feed all these people? What would you say? And what's the right answer? This is the right answer. I don't know, but I trust you. I don't know, but I trust you would have been the right answer. And I have to admit that I'm just like Philip. If Jesus turned to me and asked me how we're going to feed all these people, my first thought would have been all right, Uber Eats, I don't know if they deliver here, but I can get on my phone real fast. And I would have gone to all these details, and I would have tried to find I don't know what I would have done, but I would have gone into chaos planning mode. And it probably would have failed. And Jesus turns to him and he says, how are we going to do this? And the right answer should have been, is that he just looks up at his Lord and he says, I don't know how, but I know you love feeding people. And I know you love people. And every day that I've known you, you've been able to do things I could never imagine. And so I don't know how, but I trust you. I don't know how, but I trust you. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a dangerous way to live, right? When I get up in the morning, I don't wake up in the morning with no plan. I have a to-do list, and I have budgets in my family, and this church is so hardcore, trust me, they do audits, and they pay a lot of money for them, and they have budgets, and they have finance staff to make sure all that happens. And so we're not a crazy church. But I think if Jesus were running a church, I wonder how organized it would really be. Because if he lived like he lived then, like he lived now, what it would be like is a lot of very uncomfortable trusting. And you would walk into church on Sunday, and there might not be an order of service. And instead, the way it would work is he would just say, hey, look, I know you don't know how it's going to work, but do you trust me? It's a very dangerous way of living. And when we talk about generosity, and we talk about abundance, what we're really talking about is faith. Because I have the tendency, just like many other people, to think that I will give out of my abundance, I won't give out of my scarcity. And so the way I live my life is I think to myself, hey, if I could just make sure that my 401k is fully funded and my mortgage is paid off and I've got all of the things that I need and want tucked away, then I'll be free to give. But Jesus instead invites us into a very different way of thinking about what abundance is. And generosity fundamentally is an invitation. He's turning to Philip and he says, hey, how are we going to feed all these people? what he was really doing wasn't asking a question of how. What he was really doing is saying, hey, Philip, do you want to be a part of something awesome? Do you want to be a part of something cool? And so when Annette gets up to talk about Thanksgiving boxes, she's not saying, hey, I need you all to do these Thanksgiving boxes or people aren't going to be fed. What she's really doing is saying, hey, do you want to be a part of making someone else's Thanksgiving day a blessing as opposed to a day of scarcity? When Jesus invites us to be generous, what he's really doing is saying, I've already got it figured out. Do you want to be a part of this? And Philip, if he was doing it right, would have said, Jesus, you're nuts. I'm all in. The second part is this, though. It isn't just an invitation to be generous. Jesus goes there. But the next thing that he does is he teaches us to work with what we have, not with what we don't have. And this is how the text goes. Philip answered and says, it would take more than a year's wages to make this happen, Jesus. But then there was this little kid over on the side named Andrew, and we don't know how old he was. Think of like a teenager. Another of his disciples, it says Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. And he can you imagine the audacity? They're having a budget conversation about feeding 10,000 plus people. And this kid tugs on Jesus' shoulder, on his clothes and says, hey, Jesus, I don't really know, but there's this kid over here that has 5 pieces of bread and a couple fish. Would that work? And if you were a smart person, what would you say in response to that? Not enough! Not enough! All right, if the average person eats this, and you have that many people, you multiply this by that to get a final number, and then you take what we have, and those numbers don't match. Therefore what? Cut it. That's like human logic, right? That's how the world works. And in Jesus' kingdom, things tend to not work that way at all. And so this little kid, who's very naive probably, looks up at Jesus, but he's naive with the right kind of faith. And he looks up and he says, Jesus, I don't know how, but I trust you. This is all I got. Is that enough? This is all I have. Is that enough? One of the most powerful stories in the Bible, in my opinion, is the story of the widow's mite. And you can imagine this is how the story goes in the Bible. There's this church service that's happening. And the way it worked back then wasn't that they passed around plates. There would have been like a big jar at the entrance, right? And the jar was big enough where when you walked in, you would throw your money in. And if it was a good amount of money, it would clank around and you could hear it bouncing, And it was actually kind of like a spectacle. So people would watch how much you would give, right? Thank God we don't do that here, right? And they're watching like it's the Super Bowl. And people will walk up and they'll be they would dump in all their money and then everyone go wow, that person must be super loved by God. And there was one lady who walked up in the story that Jesus tells who only had 2 little coins. And it was all she had, the text says. And she put those 2 little coins into this jar. And of course, when she dropped it in, you couldn't hear them. The other coins probably took up all the space. And Jesus turns to his disciples. He says, you guys need to know something, that right now, angels just cheered more than you can ever imagine. Because this woman put in all that she had. And if you were looking at it from a worldly perspective, you would say, $2, how's that going to make a dent in the budget? Why would you even give that? She probably needs it so bad she shouldn't even give, right? Seriously, is that even going to make a difference? That's how the world looks at those things. Which is the insignificance of her gift from a worldly perspective made it not only insignificant, but worthless. And Jesus looks at her and he says, right there, pause. That is the kingdom. That's where everything changed on heaven and on earth because she gave from her heart and she gave what she had. She didn't wait until she was rich to be generous. She even gave to the point of sacrifice. And of course, Jesus sets the model for us in that. Did he give someone else's life in order for us to be saved? No, he gave everything. And whenever we are generous, what happens is we're invited into the kingdom life that Jesus offers, which is we're going to live not knowing how, but I trust you. Not knowing how. But if you just have this much, that's enough. There's always this temptation to think to yourself, you know what, I'll give when I have enough. And there's the scary reality, which is, comma, and there will never be enough. I've lived that life. It's a dangerous life. It's a life always full of fear, of thinking you'll never have the right amount, of always thinking there's always some better place in the future. But a world of abundance and generosity can start right now. Now, don't get me wrong, money in church is messy, and I don't have any answers to that beyond this. Is that you're called and I'm called to be generous, not because God needs it. Remember, he asked Philip, not because he already knew what he was going to do. He was going to feed these people whether Philip did it or not. God's going to build liberty. God's going to build his kingdom. God's going to do amazing things whether you participate or not. What it is an invitation to be a part of a dynamic movement of faith and of trust, of saying, God, I don't know how, but I'm all in because I've seen what you can do. It's a pretty amazing, amazing thing. I remember when we were talking about Thanksgiving boxes like a year or so ago. And I was in a missions meeting. If you want to have a good day, just go to committee meetings. And we all showed up and we were like, oh man, a committee meeting, how are we going to do this? All right. And one of the things on the agenda was like, how many Thanksgiving boxes do we do? Right? And I guess we'd done 200 the year before. And some fool, not me this time, some fool said, what if we did 250 this year? 250 boxes instead of 200. And what was the right response to that? Well, we could barely do 200 before. Why would we do 250? That doesn't make any sense. I don't know if you remember these conversations, those of you that were in it. And the debate was, well, let's just try. And what we said is like, we don't know how, but we trust you. And that's like a little tiny snapshot of the way life works behind the scenes at Liberty. Obviously, we have strategic plans. Obviously, we have budgets. And obviously, we do all these things and audits and what have you. But the real fundamental thing operating behind the surface, underneath the thing behind the thing, is a matter of the heart, which is, God, I don't know how, but I sense that you're calling me to do more, to be more, to give more, to share more of my life and my heart with what you want to do in the world. And it's this moment where we're like constantly saying, God, this looks dangerous, this life with you. I would have much rather trusted a Jesus who called me up on a hillside and started preaching, knowing that Chick-fil-A was being catered and I saw him setting up on the side. But instead I follow a Jesus who says, come up on this hillside. I know you don't know how it's going to work, but if you're with me, you'll walk on water. You'll see the dead raised. You'll see people's lives changed. You'll see healing where there's brokenness, and my kingdom life will invade your heart, and it'll be more than you ever dreamed of. And so abundance and giving and all these things sounds like money, but it's never, ever about that. It's about faith, and it's about trust, and it's about an invitation to an abundant life. The last thing that Jesus does is he says, hey, all right, okay, we got 2 small fish, and we got a couple pieces of bread. And everyone's still looking at him, and they're wondering, how? How is this going to work? Well, this is the how. Jesus said, have the people sit down. And it says that there was plenty of grass in that spot, and so they all sat down. And you can imagine this very awkward moment where Jesus is telling everyone to like instructions for the feeding line. There's only one problem, right? What's the problem? No food. And so he's setting up all these instructions, and they're all sitting down, and they're like, what's going on? Like, how is this going to work? And this is what it says that he does. Jesus then took the loaves, he took what he had, and then he gave thanks. And then he started passing it out, and they had as much as they ever wanted. And it says there were even basketfuls left over. We consider this one of Jesus' greatest miracles. And no one knows how it happened. No one knows how. But the secret, I think, was that Jesus took what he had, and he took it, and instead of looking down and saying, not enough, he lifted it up and he just said, thanks. God, you've given me so much. I didn't even have this bread before. And wow, look at this. Thank you so much for everything that you've given. Would you take what I have and bless it? You know, I was, I'm new to Ohio. I've been here for like 2 years and change, right? And I love it. And one of my most favorite things about Ohio is mowing my lawn. I've never had a lawn before. You think I'm joking. But like in California, the patch of grass was like the size of this stand. And our garages weren't even big enough to put a lawnmower in, even the push. And so I come to Ohio, and I have this like lawn. And I have a little riding lawnmower. It was like the price of a car. I was shocked. And I get there, and this week, I can't tell you how devastated I was from the drought. Not for the farmers and the food, but because I didn't get to mow as much as I wanted. And one of the best parts of my week is mowing. And so this week I was out mowing my lawn, and it was like, I would say 5 o'clock, the kids were home, and so they were kind of playing, and I could see them playing. And I was mowing my lawn, and there was this moment that just caught me where the sun was setting behind my little house, and I'm mowing my lawn, and the grass smelled great, and I saw my kids throwing stuff around, and there was this house that I couldn't believe I even got to live in. And I'm in Ohio, of all things, experiencing fall, which is my favorite season. I've never had fall. Like, I lived in Miami, Florida for like a decade. Guess how many years we had a good fall? 0! And I just turned off the lawnmower in my lawn in the middle of doing it all and just started weeping. And I said, God, I am so thankful. And there have been days, I'm not going to lie, where I didn't feel that way. There will be days where I'm like, God, I just got a text from my landscaper that it's going to take $170 to reseed this. And God, oh my God, look at those kids. They cost me so much money. And I'm so exhausted and stressed and tired all the time. Oh man, I wish I had more time. I'm out here mowing, but there's 50 other things I have to do. Trust me. And many of you are like, yeah, I need that email, Chris. Would you please respond? And there's a temptation for me at every given day, probably just like you, to not be thankful because of all the pressures and all the burdens that we have. And Jesus was standing in front of 5,000 people with not enough, wondering how. And he's our model for what a truly kingdom life looks like, because he took not enough and he stopped. He said, this is all I got, but it's enough and I'm thankful. And I think that thankfulness right there was what turned the corner and turned not enough into a blessing. I want you to know that as you consider whether or not to be generous to liberty, that there's never an amount that matters. Obviously, my prayer for you is that it makes you feel like you're giving in such a way where you're truly leaning into faith, leaning into generosity and having to trust Jesus with whatever that means for you, not because of money, but because of faith. That's the invitation. And so we do these boxes and we do 100,000 other things around here. They're not because we love being busy. It's because we get to participate in this awesome thing that God is doing in our midst of being a kingdom people full of generosity and experiencing in thankfulness that the world's never enough is our abundance. Will you bow your heads and pray with me? God, we thank you that on a day of harvest, on a day of Thanksgiving, on a day of bagpipes and corn, just so many good things, we just say thank you. Thank you for all you've given us. We're thankful that you turn to us like Philip and say, hey, do you want to be a part of this? God, we don't know how, but we trust you. And we remember the prayer that you taught us to pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.